Most of the time when you're first starting out the unit on quadratics, they'll give you an equation and ask you to find the roots, or in other words, where the shape it makes crosses the x-axis. And usually you can go ahead and solve that by doing some kind of factoring. But what happens later on when they give you a question that looks like this? Determine the roots of the equation to 2 decimal places. And they've given you a quadratic that looks a bit tougher. It looks like that. And if you went ahead and did product sum on that and tried to factor it, it just wouldn't work. So what do you do now? Well, this is where that quadratic formula comes in. And you might have seen it before. It looks like this. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and that whole thing is divided by 2a. Now, even though this formula might look a little intimidating at first, it's really not that bad to work with, and really all it does is it finds the roots of a quadratic equation for you, or where that shape crosses the x-axis. So let's see how we would take this quadratic and plug it into the formula to find the roots. Okay, in step 1, you'll notice that the formula has 3 variables to work with. There's a b, there is an a, and there's also a c. So it's a good idea before you do any work to list those 3 variables, because we're going to have to plug them into the formula later. So a is the very first number. It's the first coefficient, and in this case a is equal to 5. It's a positive 5. B is the number in the middle. It's the second term, and the sign is very important. It's a positive 6. So I'm going to go ahead and list that as 6. And C, you might guess, is the final term, and it's a negative 1. And now that I've got all 3 numbers listed, I can start plugging them into the formula. Now I'll go ahead and I'll write out the quadratic formula and just plug in the numbers I listed in the first step. And I'll be mindful of this negative b. There's a minus sign in front of it, and a lot of students forget that. So be careful when you sub in your values. I'm going to have 6 squared minus 4 times a is 5 times c is negative 1. And I'll be careful to extend this square root sign all the way to the end. And it's all divided by 2 times a, which again is 5. And that's my first step for subbing in all the values. Next, I'm going to go ahead and just start to clean up this formula a little bit so I can get my answer. I'll put the negative and the 6 together, dropping the bracket to make negative 6, and I'll have plus or minus the square root of some number, which is the result of this math. So I'm going to do my calculator for that, and I'll just show you what I'm doing. 6 squared minus 4 times 5 times negative 1. Just like I see there, and I get 56. So we have the square root of 56, and it's all divided by 2 times 5 is 10. Now if you think back, most of the time when you're factoring, you end up with 2 answers, or 2 roots, because the shape tends to cross the x-axis at 2 different spots. And using the quadratic formula is no different. This plus and minus is going to mean I'll usually have 2 answers. One will be plus, and of course the other one will just be minus. Square root 56 divided by 10. And my other answer I'll say or x equals, and I'll have the same thing but with a minus sign instead of the plus. So don't forget that part too. 2 answers. And last, we just need to solve for these for 2 decimal places like the question asks, and that'll involve some calculator work. I'll just skip the calculator work for that step for the sake of time, but it's really just punching in what I see there. And I'll show you my 2 answers. X equals 0.15 or x equals negative 1.35, being sure to round to 2 decimal places. Okay, so there you go. There's the typical steps for using the quadratic formula, and it finds the roots for you, or where a shape crosses the x-axis. Alright, so now let's get you practicing the quadratic formula on your own. I'll give you a quadratic that says determine the roots of the equation to 2 decimal places, and your equation looks like this. 9x squared minus 12x plus 2 equals 0. So try out the steps on the left and see what you get. Good luck. Your roots are x equals 1.14 or x equals 0.20. And if you didn't quite get that, make sure you had this step right, where you subbed in your a, b, and c values, because a lot of times students miss negatives. For instance, this negative and this negative will make a positive 12 on the next line. So little things like that. And make sure that you got the square root of 72. Okay, so 1.14 and 0.20.